Assalamu alaikum. I hope I find you good and happy and a good state of mind. Looking forward to brighter days when we can interact, when we can meet. And let me share it with you that now I realize the meaning of interaction, whether it is in a classroom or whether it is an outside classroom. Let me just inform you one thing. Most of the readings that I have been presenting to you are from the book, The First Spring. And this book is in 2 volumes, part 1 and part 2 by Abraham Areli. And today we are going to talk about the cultural fusion, and the reading starts with cultural interaction. This is from a very renowned historian of India, Rumela Thapa, and the book is The Penguin History of Early India, from origins to AD 1300. So let's see how was the culture in classical India. The Greco-Roman idea of culture and artifacts was obvious in the north, the Gandhara. This was doubtless due to the longer association of northwestern India as a neighbor of Hellenistic culture. Exchange of merchandise led inevitably to an exchange of ideas. At one level, words largely of a technical kind were borrowed. At another level, the aesthetic impact is seen particularly in Buddhist art. Buddhism may have been more popular with the Hellenistic Greek because it provided easier access to Indian society than Brahmanism. Excuse me. One of the enduring results of this contact was the fairly detailed reference to India in the various works of the Mediterranean world, such as Diodorus' Library of History, and Strabo's Geography, and Aryan's Indica. So the others were writing afresh. These works began to supersede the accounts associated with Alexander's campaign. India was now visible in the Greco-Roman world, not merely as a land of fabulous, but more realistically as a place with potential for trade and with tradition of knowledge that interested Mediterranean scholars. The most direct and visible interface was in the realm of art, with the emergence of Gandhara art in Afghanistan and northwest India. Gandhara art evolved a mixture of styles, one of which was the Greco-Roman style of Alexandria, from where sculpture in bronze and stucco traveled along the West Asian trade routes to influence Hellenistic and Indian models nearer home. We can trace Indian ideas in somewhat West Asian belief systems, and particularly in the doctrines of Manichaeans, Gnostics, and New Platonists. The last of these had a long and eventful history in Europe as an alternative philosophy to the Judeo-Christian tradition. Connection through embassies were even more direct. The best known of those sent by Indian kingdoms to Rome was the one that sailed from Bargaza in about 25 BC. It included a strange assortment of men and animals, tigers, pheasants, snakes, tortoises, a monk, and an armless boy who could shoot arrows with his toes, all regarded as appropriate for the Roman Empire. Communication with the West was not the only exciting possibility, for these centuries also saw the beginning of Indian contact with China and the introduction of Indian culture to Southeast Asia. Chinese Buddhists traveled to Central Asia to learn about Buddhism, while the more courageous undertook the difficult journey to India to study the text at various Buddhist monasteries. Among the more valuable sources on Buddhism in recent time is the Unraveling of the Buddhist Scroll from Gandhara, now placed in the British Library. The texts are composed in the Gandhari version of Prakrit and written in Kharoshthi, expressive of a strong regional tradition. The form an interesting counterpart both to the northern Buddhist texts written in hybrid Sanskrit and to the Buddhist canon as recorded by the southern Theravada tradition in Pali. The texts are part of Buddhist canon, and some of anthologies of stories linked to Buddhism. These were the texts and forms of Buddhism that traveled to Central Asia, where Gandhara Prakrit was used in Buddhist circles. Prakrit is always a language that is spoken commonly by people. Voyage to Southeast Asia ports were encouraged by the search for spices. Graffiti in Brahmi on sherds, carnelian beads, and rouletted ware surface in Southeast Asia at places accessible to ships from the Bay of Bengal. The Kalingans who came as traders are said to have settled in the Irrawaddy delta of Myanmar. Indian literature narrates the adventures, some weird and fantastic, of Indian travelers in these parts. In local narratives, the formation of states in Southeast Asia is sometimes linked to the arrival of Indians as traders and as ritual specialists. So the transition was from chiefdoms to states, and perhaps because of the presence of Indians, appropriate Indian practices and beliefs were adapted. The epithet of Savarna, gold, with place names in Southeast Asia suggest that the Indian perception of Southeast Asia was initially probably linked to profits from trade. If we connect literature with the systems of knowledge and education, so we find that the guilds provided education, although formal education remained largely in the hands of the Brahmins. Knowledge of mining, metallurgy, weaving, dyeing, carpentry, and all such things would have been maintained by the relevant guild. Engineering skill in the building of dams and irrigation tanks is evident from their remains. Geometry, which had first been recorded as an aid in the building of altars and sacrificial structures, was later applied to more complex architecture. The architecture of freestanding monasteries was an extension of domestic architecture. Knowledge benefiting from familiarity with developments in other parts of the world was applied to astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. A sharpened sense of time in relation to past events associated with human activities took shape as linear time. So they were coming to grasp the idea of time implicit in literature of historical kind and in a multiplicity of eras. The texts were obviously written by those who had received a formal education. Yet Brahminical rule placed the practitioners of medicine low on the social scale. We talked about the medicine in Ayurveda because Indian herbal knowledge has reached the Western world since the Greek botanist Theophrastus gave details of the medicinal use of various Indian plants and herbs and the history of plants. These texts about the medicine were naturally written by authors with a formal education, generally Brahmins, or those people who were associated with Brahmins. Presumably some of them were practitioners of the profession of medicine. Linguistic analysis had resulted in Panini's Grammar of Sanskrit, one great work on grammar in Sanskrit, which became the bedrock of the language. The grammarian of this period was Patanjali, whose Mahabhashya, a commentary on the earlier grammar, is an impressive study of syntax and the evolution of words. Analysis of language through grammar was to remain a monumental contribution of early Indian thought. It is curious, though, that with all the interest in Greek writings, no Indian grammarian stumbled on the parallels in Sanskrit and Greek. And then literary output was not restricted to dharma shastras and grammars, but poetry and drama were also very popular. The short poems in Prakrit by Hala, the Gatha Sappathathi, touch the love, some being sentimental and others rather bawdy but enjoyable, witty. Among works in Sanskrit, the Vajrasuchi ascribed the Ashkava Ghosha is a Buddhist tract critical of both Brahmins and the social system that they upheld. And he is better known for his long poem on the life of Buddha, the Buddha Charita, which was also seminal to the evolution of historical biographies. This did not, however, lead to the abandoning of the local languages of local Prakrits. The tendency to demarcate the culture of the elite and the formally educated, what is said to be high culture, from popular culture, became more marked. Unlike earlier periods, much of the literature drew on an urban background in its authorship, content, and style. City life was by now distinctive, as evidenced by the reference to major cities such as Takshala, Mathura, Shishupalgarh, Mahasthan, Nagarjunakonda, and Kevaneri Patanipam. Brahmanical sources remain dubious about or even hostile to urban life. Now, what were the impact of these literature and other intellectual activities on social forms? The sharpening of stratification of theoretical level may have been a Brahmanical response to the more flexible attitudes reflected by, for example, by Buddhist texts. Some jatis normally ranked in the lower half of the social scale may have exploited the demands of urban life by attempting an improvement of their status, causing concern to the upholders of orthodox social law. The presence of nuns in Jain and Buddhist monasteries and in their centers is striking both in terms of their numbers and fact of personal wealth, which enable them to make grants. So where there is a concern of a donation by a nun, the source of the wealth is unclear. Was the wealth of the women their stridhana, the wealth given to a woman by her mother, or a kinswoman, or a relative over which in theory she alone had control? The right to stridhana means the woman's wealth, was partially to balance the exclusion of women as heirs of patrimonial property, except in the absence of male heirs when the patrimony might be allocated to the daughter. This emphasized the point that knowing the authorship, intention, and audience of text is essential to understanding what they say, and this refers to formulated as in Dharam Shastras. It would be incorrect to take the latter as the normal practice and the social code of these times. The architectural and visual expression had a lot of artistic and visual aesthetics in both architecture, and sculpture generally arose from the requirements of the Buddhism. The origin of the Buddhist stupa, traced to pre-Buddhist burial mounds, was a hemispherical mound built by a sacred relic either of the Buddha himself or of a sanctified monk or saint. So, underlining the separation of the sacred and the profane areas was the spilling out of the daily life. Townspeople are shown standing on balconies, curious about passers-by, and drawing attention to the cityscape. At each of the four cardinal points in the art of Buddhism, there was a break in railing for a large gateway, giving the sculptor further scope to show their skill. The stupa itself did not offer much scope to an architect. The gateways were based on wooden prototypes used in villages and towns, and where the excavation of a cave was accompanied by a generous donation from a patron, ambitious attempts were made to stimulate a series of caves, the entire complex of a stupa. Then if we go to Gandhara period, the art of Gandhara reflected Buddhist patronage, although other deities and themes were not ignored there. Terracotta figures were plentiful, some being toys, other decorative objects or figures used in rituals. So we find that this was the seminal period of the evolution of the temple, which housed images that the Vaishnavas and Shivas were beginning to worship. The temples tended to be small and inconspicuous compared to Buddhist monuments during this period, focusing on a room to house the image, but they come into their own in the later periods.